Salt Lake City, September 30th. Vice President Agnew.
Well, first of all, let me say that I didn't read Senator Goodell out of the party. He read himself out of the party by his conduct and his actions in the past year, maybe a little longer than that. Now, he's a radical liberal. There isn't any doubt of that. I think he has an ADA rating of about 85% at the present time, higher than any other Republican in the Senate. He's in a class by himself, is what I'm saying to you.
October 25th, 1970. A New York Daily News poll declares that Charles Goodell, incumbent Republican senator from New York, is projected to finish third in the New York State Senate race. Many are calling for Goodell, the first senator to come out in opposition of the Vietnam War, to drop out of the race. Goodell spends serious time with his advisors and his family discussing the decision, which he has scheduled for this evening before a nationally televised audience, famously preempting the hit television series Lassie.
It's a very agonizing moment for me.
This would be the first loss in Goodell's career. Born in Jamestown, New York in 1926, Charles Ellsworth Goodell Jr. was the youngest in a family of 5. His father was a doctor. His mother served as president of the Jamestown and Chautauqua County Medical Auxiliaries. He graduated from Jamestown High School in 1944 and served 2 years in the United States Navy as a seaman second class. He graduated from Williams College in 1948, moved on to Yale Law School, where he received his Juris Doctor in 1951, and earned a graduate degree from the Yale University Graduate School of Government in 1952. At the same time, he made a living for himself by serving as a chemistry and science teacher at Quinnipiac College, and upon receiving his degree, returned to serve as a first lieutenant in the Air Force during the Korean War from 1952 to 1953. In August of 1953, a 27-year-old Charles Goodell and friend George Constantine attended a luncheon in Boston where U.S. Attorney General Herbert Brownell Jr. was addressing Yale Law School graduates. Sitting at the luncheon with the two young men was then U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson. Goodell, as a young boy, grew up living next door to Jackson on Fairmount Avenue. On that day, Brownell spoke of the importance for young men to get involved in public service. The concept intrigued Goodell, who spoke with Jackson after the luncheon. Jackson supplied a letter recommending the two young men for a job in the Department of Justice. "He is the kind of youth I am confident the Attorney General is trying to interest in public service," said Jackson of Goodell in the letter. The recommendation was successful, and Goodell was hired as a congressional liaison for the department from 1953 to 1954. In 1954, he passed the New York State Bar exam and returned to Jamestown to open up his private practice at Van Vleck, Goodell, and McKee.
I had been a Republican all my life. Started in the Eisenhower administration, then to a town board, Republican county chairman, and Congress.
In 1959, 43rd District Representative Daniel A. Reed died in Washington at the age of 83. To replace him, District Republicans sought their 33-year-old Chautauqua County Committee chair to run on their ticket, Charles Goodell. In May of 1959, Goodell was elected by a 2-to-1 margin to fill Reed's term. He was elected to a full term in 1960 and re-elected subsequently in 1962, 1964, and 1966. The Goodells were off to Washington. In Congress, he allied himself with Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan and Congressman Donald Rumsfeld of Illinois in the political alliance known as the Young Turks. They conspired to make Ford House Minority Leader in 1966. Goodell did work well, though, with Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He supported Kennedy on the Equal Pay Act and supported Johnson on a majority of his Great Society reforms, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But then, tragedy struck.
So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that
In June of 1968, Robert Kennedy was killed in California while campaigning for the presidency. New York now had a vacant seat in the U.S. Senate, and the search began for a new senator from New York for Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller. The challenge? Finding someone of opposite party to replace the ever-popular Kennedy. Others considered for the job included John W. Gardner, former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and then president of the Urban Coalition, Westchester Representative Ogden Reed, New York State Secretary of State John P. Lomenzo, State Senator Edward J. Spano of Nassau, and Bronx Representative Paul A. Fino. But Goodell had worked that summer to separate himself from the crowd.
Today I announce my active candidacy for the nomination by the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States.
He had supported Rockefeller at the Republican National Convention in Miami over former Vice President Richard M. Nixon. Additionally, Rockefeller was particularly impressed with Goodell's efforts in amending the party's platform on the war in Vietnam. And, despite the congressman's initial opposition to him, upon his appointment, then-nominee Nixon referred to Goodell to the New York Times as the Republican Party's quote-unquote egghead in Congress, a creative intellectual in the best sense of the word. Rockefeller announced his appointment of Goodell on September 10, 1968. Rockefeller wrote to Goodell, "I am assured by our long conversations, and by your public record of service to the people, that in you there will be a successor in whom the people of New York State can place full trust, the Republican Party can take true pride, and the friends and supporters of Senator Kennedy will find a man not only of the same generation, but on sharing a remarkable identity of concerns and approaches to solutions of the great problems before the nation." In accepting the appointment, Goodell said, "I believe that potential is upon us. The conscience of our people is aroused. They are ready to right the wrongs in government and in our nation as a whole. They are ready to combine the arrival of conscience with the assertion of action, but they must have leadership that understands the imperatives of our times. We can yet bridge the yawning gaps in our society between the aware and the unaware, the black, the white, and the rich and the poor. My talents, whatever they may be, will be devoted to that end." Goodell's workload soon changed, and his voice now had greater potential to be heard. He and Senator Jacob Javits united on a progressive vision for the country and New York State. Meanwhile, in Chautauqua County, Goodell was hailed as a hometown hero, and was invited to speak at high school graduations at JHS in Maple Grove, college graduations at St. Bonaventure University and the University at Buffalo, and at his beloved Chautauqua institution, where he had spent nearly every summer since his childhood. Early in his first year, he also made a highly publicized trip to Biafra, in the midst of the Nigerian Civil War, to learn more about the secessionist state. Upon his return, he advocated for a greater role by the United Nations in halting the conflict, which eventually ended in January of 1970. Additionally, he opposed Supreme Court nominees Clement Haynsworth and G. Harold Carswell. This frustrated the Nixon administration and initiated the president's eventual opposition toward Goodell in the 1970 Senate elections. But bigger problems remained.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
On September 25, 1969, Senator Charles Goodell rose before the United States Senate to propose the Vietnam Disengagement Act, Bill S-3000, that would cut off all funds to support the war after a fixed date.
45,000 young Americans have already died in Vietnam in the past 6 years. Today, American soldiers fall at the average rate of 150 a week. This slaughter must cease. The prosecution of the war with American troops must be ended, not just reduced. The only way of halting the loss of our young men's lives is to establish a clear timetable for terminating all American combat operations and troop commitments in Vietnam within the near future.
Having traveled throughout the country's colleges during the spring of 1969, Goodell saw firsthand the outrage that had developed among students over the war. By that summer, the student moratorium, a peaceful movement to end the war, had begun. The anti-war movement culminated on November 15, 1969, when the moratorium march on Washington took place. Goodell and noted anti-war Senator George McGovern both debated on whether or not they would participate. Coretta Scott King, widow of the recently assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., then stated that she would only participate, only if Goodell and McGovern did. They participated.
The United States said nothing you young kids would do would have any effect on him. Well, I suggest to the President of the United States, if he wants to know how much effect you youngsters can have on the President, he should make one long-distance phone call to the LBJ Ranch and ask that boy how much effect you can have. Tragically, our nation's leadership, while striving for peace, has adopted a course that makes real peace unlikely. It is a policy that believes we can brutalize the North Vietnamese into making concessions at the negotiating table, that we can convert by words alone a corrupt Saigon government into a government representative and responsive to the needs of its people.
The march had been a success. In Political Prisoners in America, Goodell's book released in 1973, he wrote, "As McGovern, Coretta King, and I led the march down Pennsylvania Avenue, Mrs. King turned to say, 'This is the most impressive march I've ever participated in, and I've been in a lot. The people are all so committed, so peaceful and gentle.'" However, Goodell's opposition to the war quickly turned him from the president's friend to his inter-party foe.
There's the man with a message.
No, I don't live here in New York, but you can bet your boots if I did, I'd plan now to vote for James Buckley for United States Senator.
There is even the candidate who buys time to say he can't afford to buy enough time.
Well, I can tell you this, if I had my opponent's money, I wouldn't have to settle for such short commercials.
In the 1970 election, Goodell would face off against Capital District Democratic Representative Richard Ottinger and conservative James L. Buckley, brother of conservative media pioneer William F. Buckley. However, his independent attitude frustrated the Nixon administration. Goodell quickly was placed on the infamous enemies list. After many months filled with doubt, Goodell still was able to secure the Republican nomination and an endorsement from Rockefeller, despite the governor's own frustration toward the junior senator from New York.
I originally appointed Senator Goodell from his seat in the House to fill the vacancy left by the tragic assassination of Senator Kennedy. I urged his nomination to the members of the State Committee, and he has been was selected unanimously by the State Committee. I'm meeting with him today at lunch on campaign strategy, and we in the Republican Party believe in party unity.
President Nixon, however, refused to endorse Goodell, and via Press Secretary Ronald Ziegler endorsed Buckley instead.
The Republican nominee has indicated that he preferred to conduct an independent campaign outside of White House assistance. The third candidate, who is a Republican, and the conservative nominee, has supported the president on the major issues, and the president appreciates the support. Due to these circumstances, the president will refrain from his normal practice of endorsing the Republican nominee in the New York Senate race.
As if the lack of endorsement wasn't enough, Vice President Spiro Agnew unleashed a series of verbal attacks on Goodell, publicly referring to him as the Christine Jorgensen of the Republican Party, likening his political shift to the World War II veteran Jorgensen's sex reassignment surgery.
To openly divorce himself from our president and from the Nixon administration. I will not support a radical liberal no matter what party he belongs to.
It has now become clear that Vice President Agnew has embarked upon a campaign to purge me from the United States Senate. The Vice President of the United States has evidently decided that he will determine who shall sit in the United States Senate from New York and who shall not sit in the United States Senate from New York. The implications of Mr. Agnew's intervention go far beyond the fact the Vice President and I have disagreed on some issues.
On October 22, 1970, a long list of celebrities, scientists, and scholars announced their endorsement for Goodell, including Betty Friedan, Coretta Scott King, Noam Chomsky, Dr. Benjamin Spock, and Jane Fonda. New York City Mayor John Lindsay and his contemporary Javits also made their support of Goodell public.
I'm very proud to be endorsing for re-election to the United States Senate Senator Charles Goodell. I think this would be a very good thing for our city if the public should return him to office.
Still, Goodell continued to poll low, most notably in a New York Daily News poll released just over a week before the election. Many called upon him to withdraw from the race, including Ottinger, who feared that the Liberal-endorsed Goodell would split the Liberal votes and hand Buckley the election.
Well, I think it's clear not only from the Daily News poll, but also from all the other independent polls that have been taken, that Senator Goodell is out of the race. And we can't allow Spiro Agnew's very crass, cold political effort to try and gain sympathy for him by attacking him, and thereby electing Jim Buckley to work, because that's the real threat in the state.
On October 25, 1970, Goodell announced that he would continue in the race via a television address that famously preempted the hit television show Lassie.
I have stood for election in the United States Senate, and I shall continue to stand for election in the United States Senate. I believe in my country, and I think I can win this election with your support. If you'll all vote for me who want me in the United States Senate and put aside party lines, I know I will be returned there. Thank you.
I'll stand with you. And I think Rockefeller will stand with you. And every other right-thinking New Yorker will stand with you to refute this and to elect you. You're the target, not your opponent. You. To elect you precisely to disprove what you're being made the object lesson for in this state.
So that on behalf of my colleagues who want you back in the Senate, I am honored to be here in New York to support Governor Rockefeller's re-election, to support your re-election and the Republican ticket. I campaigned for all Republican candidates that have asked me to, and I was honored to be asked to be here as my colleague and friend with you this evening.
However, his attempts to gain momentum in the last week was not successful.
Liberal politics sent a conservative to the Senate. With thinly veiled White House help, James Buckley got 39% of the vote to 37% for the Liberal Democrat and 24% for the Liberal Republican incumbent.
It has been a genuine coalition of the people to reach out and take this great state and push it in a new direction and to telegraph across the country that the American people want a new course, they want a new politics, and I am the voice for that new politics.
I do believe that I have succumbed to tides that are running in this country that are wrong, but we can change those tides.
Begin by saying that you aren't going to have Charlie Goodell to kick around any longer. And neither will the president or the vice president.
Goodell received a hero's welcome after finishing out his Senate term. Immediately, speculation began as to what his plans would be moving forward. The most common question, would he seek to primary Nixon in the 1972 presidential election?
Good evening.
He never had the chance. With the controversy surrounding the break-in at Democratic headquarters ahead of the 1972 election, Nixon was forced to resign in August of 1974.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Succeeding him, Goodell's fellow Young Turk, Gerald Ford. Speculation then began as to what role Goodell would serve in Ford's administration. Attorney General, Supreme Court Justice, or even Vice President. Instead, Ford placed Goodell in charge as chairman of the Clemency Review Board to determine who among war deserters and draft evaders would receive amnesty and clemency. Additionally, he gained notoriety as a member of the legal counsel that defended Pentagon Papers holder Daniel Ellsberg. He continued to spend his summers at Chautauqua Institution, spending a great deal of time with his 5 sons, William, Tim, Roger, Michael, and Jeffrey. Goodell continued to make public appearances as a commencement speaker and as a lecturer at Chautauqua. A speaking appearance by Charlie in 1974 gave Jamestown High School classmate and WJTN radio host Jim Roselli the idea to broadcast his shows in the summer, live from Chautauqua Institution.
And I went into Mr. Willem's office, our general, and I said, "Carl, I'm going to Chautauqua when Charlie Goodell gives a talk." He says, "You are?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Isn't it our job to do public service? Isn't it our job to bring on the local stories?" And I said, "Let's do it." And he said, "Here's a salesman for you. You think anybody will buy it?"
He continued to do this until his death in 2016. Goodell also wrote a book in 1973, Political Prisoners in America, with a dedication, quote unquote, "To my friend Richard Nixon, may he do more than listen." At the young age of 60, Charles Goodell passed away on January 21st, 1987. After his passing, Goodell, who was once called politically divisive for speaking out against the war, was hailed for his courage in displaying the moral outrage that existed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the man who now occupied the seat formerly held by Kennedy and Goodell, eulogized him in saying, "I have not known a finer member of Congress."
This morning's program is sponsored by the Charles Ellsworth Goodell Lectureship in Government and Public Affairs.
His legacy survives through his boys. Among them, middle son Roger, who became commissioner of the National Football League in 2006. During a lecture at Chautauqua Institution in 2008, Goodell explained how his father's courage impacted his family.
It was a defining moment for him, I think, but it was also an important lesson for myself and I'm sure my 4 brothers, that he stood up for what he thought was right, and he did at a tremendous cost because he lost his political career after that. But he never regretted that. He stood up for what he believed was right.
I think a United States Senator has to provide leadership. That means that he has to speak up on unpopular issues at times. He has to fight the tide, when the tide, in his opinion, is running wrong, when the frustrations of our people accumulate to lead them to simplistic solutions that will not solve.